Hello and welcome to Sport Quotes and Facts Untold. Today I'm joined by Lee Wingate, who is a football translator and a podcast host around Europe. Lee, how's it going?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Thanks very much for having me on. I know this is a brand new show, so I'm delighted to be on.
No, I mean, you're very experienced now, Lee, in all things podcast. I mean, how long have you been doing it now?
Probably about 10 years, I would say, although some of the creations have been more recent things. The OtherBundesliga 2018, SQaF, even more recent than that. So mostly my background is in translation.
Yeah. So, and that's what I was going to ask you about first. So you are a football translator. Sounds like a real dream job for someone who likes language and someone who likes football. How long have you been in that industry?
Well, I'll start by saying, unlike Jose Mourinho, I don't think it's ever going to progress to me being a Champions League winning coach. But it started in 2012 when I graduated from university, and I wanted to stay working in football somehow. And that opportunity arose to work on Euro 2012, basically proofreading and translating for the various teams using my languages, which are French and German. And after that, the company that I did that with, which is Clark Football Languages, which is a bespoke football language company, the great people there gave me an opportunity to start working for them. And that, was first of all, the form that took was doing some interpreting assignments because I was living in around London at the time. And then that sort of progressed since I moved to Vienna in 2014 to website translations and basically online translation for football clubs, but on a whole host of stuff, a lot of different material.
Yeah, and the two clubs you sort of work closely with, Lee, are Borussia Dortmund and Hoffenheim. Borussia Dortmund are obviously the bigger of the two, but, Hoffenheim have had a long history, recent history in the Bundesliga now. So what's that experience been like to be involved in a league where, it has really grown in popularity over the last decade?
It's great. And, one of the things that I didn't expect was how invested I would become emotionally in those two clubs. And when Borussia Dortmund didn't quite manage to get over the line on the final day of last season, it was genuinely really tough because you create quite a strong emotional bond over those years of working for both clubs as well. Hoffenheim are a remarkable story in their own way. So it's definitely been something unexpected in that regard. The day-to-day part of it is unpredictable, and that's what I like. One of the clubs might be on a summer tour and you're doing something for them. There might be an important press release that needs to go out about a new manager or a player. There might also be, like a match day, which is where most of the work comes from. And match days and weekends tend to be incredibly busy where you're watching the game, so you know what you're going to be writing about afterwards. Sometimes when you've got a piece of text which describes a scene in German, they'll do it incredibly differently to how they would in English. You need to kind of see it, know what you're describing, and then describe it in your own words. So watching the matches and then doing the reactions afterwards. So that's the match reports, the interviews with the players. And that is, it takes quite a lot of time. And often there'll be a Champions League night where the game will finish at 11 o'clock at night. And I'll be working until 2 or 3 so that all the content is on the website that night. There are people around the world in the USA, for example, that would read a lot of that and they'll be 5-6 hours behind. So they'll not want to wait until the next morning. So you get all the content up really quickly. And yeah, it's fast paced, it's demanding. And it does take a lot of skill. I think a lot of people think if you just speak another language, you can just be a translator. It's a bit more complicated than that. But I absolutely love it. And I feel very grateful, especially to Clark Football Languages for giving me that opportunity.
Yeah, and in terms of the translation, Lee, I know you're a good writer yourself. Is it very literal translation you do, or can you write it in a way that is still your style, if that makes sense?
I like to be as creative as possible while also staying faithful to the source language. And so that's generally my approach. When it's quotations, you tend to try and stay very close because it's reported speech. But German sentence structures and the way they write is very different. So I like to almost transcreate and make it my own text without, moving too far away from what is originally there. I think that's one of the reasons I like working in sports, because if you work in technical translation or something like that, it's sentence in German, sentence in English, but you get to merge things, move things around a little bit and make it sound like it would be in English. And I think that's one of the things that appeals as a writer.
Yeah, and obviously working closely with the clubs league, have you? I know that you're based in Vienna, but have you had the opportunity to watch live games or sort of meet the teams that you're writing on?
So most of the work is remote. I know that I'd be, welcome. Both of the clubs are very welcoming for me to go at any time. I did actually go along to a Borussia Dortmund game a couple of years back when I got the opportunity. The pandemic hasn't really helped in that respect. Travel was curbed for a few years, but yeah, I went to see Borussia Dortmund play in the DFB Pokal against Werder Bremen a few years back. And that was like, even when you write about that atmosphere on a weekly basis, it's not the same as like actually being there and feeling the sheer noise and the force of it and the emotion. So it really is incredible. As much as you hear about Dortmund, you haven't truly experienced it until you've been. So I have been in to Signal Iduna Park. I haven't got to Hoffenheim yet, and that is probably very close to the top of my bucket list. I know you wanted to talk a little bit about bucket lists later, but that is very high because the Pre-Zero Arena in Hoffenheim is, I think, the first zero waste stadium in Germany, which is, it's very impressive, some of the innovation that they're leading with there. So that's very high up as well. And I do have some signed shirts by Erling Haaland and Andre Kramaric as well, which are among my most prized possessions. So, yeah, there's a few memories there.
Yeah, and what would you say the highlights have been, Lee? I know Dortmund have obviously been very successful, but as you mentioned before, Hoffenheim have had success in their own right. It is only it's a village team, isn't it, that have had major success. And we've seen it in England in the Premier League. Teams have had a few seasons in the top flight, but it does seem to catch up with them. Whereas Hoffenheim have had a really steady, decade.
Yeah, this season's been more difficult for them. There have been a few seasons here and there where they have been closer to the drop zone, but they're about to go into their 16th successive Bundesliga season, which is incredible when you think that this club was down in the sort of 8th or 9th tier of German football about 25 years ago. And there are a lot of people out there who will say, yes, money, but as we see in football now, like money has to be spent well. And actually, aside from the initial investments, Hoffenheim has been almost entirely sustainably run for the last few years, and they have one of the biggest, I think, transfer surpluses in the Bundesliga over the past decade. They're just a very well-run club. So that's been great. And in terms of a highlight, them being in the Champions League in the group stages and working on that was amazing. And Borussia Dortmund, winning the DFB Pokal has also, something that, as I say, I'm so emotionally invested now that was really great to see some of those efforts and some of those players that have put a lot in over the past few years actually win, get something as a reward for their efforts. So, yeah, it's hard to pick out individual highlights, to be honest. My memory is terrible, and that's one reason. And it's been sort of 10 years now that I've been doing this sort of thing. So there's a lot to pick from.
Yeah, and obviously, just for people who don't know who are listening, there's also, when you mentioned about the ownership of Hoffenheim, there is a rule in Germany, isn't there? Is it 51%? Can you just go into a bit of that about how that works and how it's benefited the Bundesliga, but also if there's any disadvantages?
Well, to go straight in on the disadvantages, obviously there's so much money being pumped into other European countries, and it's only a select few, and it's mostly in England, but I suppose it distorts the competition a little bit on a European scale, and I feel like we might get to a point very, very soon where it is just English clubs or maybe occasionally a Real Madrid or a Bayern Munich competing, and some of the other clubs might find it a little bit difficult simply because of that rule. But I really like that rule because what it essentially means is that the ownership stays in the hands of the fans and that the majority cannot pass to an outside investor. There are 3 exceptions to that. Hoffenheim are one of them. The other 2 are, I think, Bayer Leverkusen and I want to say, it's not immediately coming to my mind. Wolfsburg, because they're the Volkswagen club. So there are some exceptions to it, but I just really like the fact that fans are at the forefront in Germany. And what the rule means is that there's, you see countless clubs in other countries, lots in England, where they're not happy with their owners and, the fact that they sort of feel the club doesn't belong to them anymore. And you don't really get that in Germany. So one of the things I love most about German football are the fans are at the forefront. And when the whole thing in the UK happened with the Super League, and it really just felt like the fans didn't matter anymore. And you look at some of the match day prices for tickets and everything, it feels like it's all about commercial success. And in Germany, I don't really have that feeling as much. Of course, money talks, but that's what I really like, I think, about German football.
Yeah. And of course, Lee, since the pandemic, more and more of us have learned how to work remotely, but that's been your career pretty much the whole time. When you sort of got the job and realized you could work remote, what took you to Vienna?
I think that was just a love for the German language and a realization that I wanted to do something different, because I'd already lived in Germany during Erasmus, and there's only one other country in Europe where they speak German, and that's Switzerland, and it is almost incomprehensible to me. It's so difficult to understand, and that sort of left Austria as something new and a new place I might go to. And I actually only came on a 6-month trial, and here I am 10 years later, having really, really enjoyed it. So I think it's just, it sounds a bit dramatic when you say I didn't really feel like my place was in the UK or like I really belonged there, but it's not really dramatic. I just feel happier, I think, in German speaking countries, and always have done. But the whole thing about remote work was quite funny when everybody started doing that and saying, oh my God, I can work remote. And I was just like, yep, been doing that for a while. But I like it. It's sort of a freedom that I didn't really initially aim to have, but sort of landed in my lap, and it's something I wouldn't give away now.
Yeah, and your day-to-day job is in the Bundesliga, but in Vienna there is the OtherBundesliga. See what I did there? Which is your really successful podcast focusing on the Austrian league. What was it that, obviously you lived in the country, but what was it that first caught your attention to think this is a really interesting league that people should know about?
Well, firstly, from a personal perspective, I was translating every day, and as much as I love it, I wanted to do something a little bit different. So my co-host and our now presenter, Tom Midler, came home one day. We lived together at the time and said, why don't we start a podcast? And I thought to myself, well, A, that sounds just very interesting in terms of variety, but I knew that the Austrian league was a league that I just didn't know anything about at the time. And I realized that I'd spent a lot of time in Austria living there, but not actually really discovering its football or many of its other cities. And I thought, well, this could be a great opportunity to get to know a league that I don't know, and also get to know a country that I haven't really fully explored yet. And that has turned out to be the case. In terms of why the league is interesting, there are so many reasons why I think other people should find out a little bit more about it, because it's almost like getting a peek behind the curtain of football, because it's such a breeding ground for young talent that I know that there are players that I'm watching now that everybody is going to be talking about in 2 years' time, once they've either gone to Germany or they've subsequently gone on to the Premier League. And it feels like you're sort of getting inside information. And those players mostly come from Salzburg. They're the dominant force here. But yeah, it's just great to be able to see some of the young players that have come through here. And it's also genuinely, it's an exciting league. So we did I think there was a comparison of the number of goals scored a couple of seasons ago in leagues across Europe, and the Austrian Bundesliga, it just comes out right near the top. There's a lot of goals. I don't know what that says about the defending. It certainly says something about the attacking, but it's an exciting league to watch. And it also, the last thing, it has a great fan culture, which I think some people sort of underestimate a little bit, because you've got bigger countries like the UK or Germany that have these huge fan bases. But in its own right, Austria is quite special. And I went to the cup final down in Klagenfurt in May, or the end of April rather. And, you got fireworks going off inside the stadium, 2 sets of really passionate fans. And I was just thinking, this doesn't get the credit it deserves as a fan culture as well. So there are lots of reasons why Austrian football is very lovable.
Yeah. And Lee, would you just be able to just give us a quick breakdown of sort of the teams that are usually in that top flight? Because obviously Red Bull Salzburg will be known by many modern day football fans because of their Champions League. You've got more story clubs that I think people our age will know, sort of Sturm Graz, who I think would have been in the sort of UEFA Cup in the 90s. Then you've got Rapid Vienna, who Everton defeated in the 1985 Cup Winners' Cup final. Who are the teams that you will likely see in the Austrian Bundesliga year after year?
Well, I think a lot of people might know LASK because they've been more present in Europe over the past few years. They played against Man United. That was the last game I saw before the COVID pandemic, when football shut down in Austria, at least very shortly afterwards. So LASK are one of those clubs, and they've just moved into a brand new stadium, which is sort of spoken about in Austrian football circles as almost like the Austrian version of the new Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, you know, with the beers that pour and fill from the bottom and all that sort of fancy stuff. And I've been there. It is very impressive. So LASK is one of those clubs. Sturm Graz, who won the cup final that I mentioned a second ago, are a club that have got the closest to challenging Salzburg for the league title of anyone in recent years. And they have a really good coach, Christian Ilzer, who is building something quite special there. And then, of course, you have the Vienna clubs, and Rapid and Austria, great derbies usually. They have incredible atmospheres. It's one of the most played, I think it might be the most played derby in continental Europe, and the third most after the Edinburgh and Glasgow derbies, if you're including the UK too. So there's a long rivalry there, and they're two clubs that have sort of fallen on harder times recently, but nonetheless have a great deal of tradition and history. So those are what you'd call, I suppose, the big five. And it might seem a bit strange to say the big five in a league of only 12 clubs, but those are sort of in a separate category. And the way the Austrian Bundesliga works is that after 22 rounds, so the 12 teams play each other home and away, the league then splits in half, and you have a top six and a bottom six that are locked in with each other. And usually you get those five and then one other club that makes it into the top six. And in recent years, the last 2 years, that's been Austria Klagenfurt, who are the team that play. Their home stadium is the Wörthersee Stadion, where the cup final takes place. And then you just get a few other clubs that are really interesting in their own right. You get Hartberg, this tiny village club down in Styria, who have about 20 sponsors on their shirts. You have two clubs in Vorarlberg, which is the western region of Austria, right over by Switzerland. Lustenau, who just got promoted last summer, and Altach. You got a few clubs there that are just really interesting as well. So there's a whole mix.
Yeah, and you mentioned Red Bull Salzburg, Lee, and you know it's just a conveyor belt of talent, isn't it? It's incredible that the youth players they sign, but obviously, like any nation, Man United in the 90s weren't really liked. Bayern Munich in Germany, because they keep winning, weren't really liked. Is that the same in Austria? That because Red Bull Salzburg are so dominant, they're not probably appreciated that much?
Yeah, I think so. I think success breeds contempt in many instances. I was actually quite surprised because a couple of years ago, I went down to the cup final when it was between Salzburg and Rapid, and I spoke to some Rapid fans on the train that were saying, we actually admire what they're doing there because they're running a football club so well. But I think that that's a relatively rare viewpoint among the tradition-steeped clubs, because if you look across Europe at all sort of 55 countries in Europe, I don't think there is another one that has won as many trophies as Salzburg. If you take into consideration the league and the main domestic cup, I think Salzburg have won 14 out of the last 16 trophies or something mad like that. And I think that there's a lot of contempt because essentially you're just competing for second place in the league. So they are disliked in that regard. There is also another argument that as just general lovers of Austrian football like me and my other Bundesliga co-hosts, they have really helped improve Austria's standing and taken them up to a high of 8th in the UEFA country coefficient, which has massively benefited Austrian football as well. But I think, you know what it's like, club fans don't necessarily see the bigger picture when their team is affected.
Yeah, definitely. And Lee, what do you know what the secret is behind the success of how they are able to find so many players across, so many continents, really? It is incredible.
Yeah, I was saying on a recent pod, I was saying now they seem to be targeting Scandinavia a little bit more because they've brought in Well, they had Haaland, who I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit, but they also brought in Olof Mellberg's son. I don't know if you remember Olof Mellberg. They brought in John Mellberg's son from Sweden, and they've brought in so many players from Africa, some really great players from Japan as well. I think they just have an incredible scouting network. The Red Bull, it sounds a bit of a simplified answer, but the scouting network is incredible. And over time, what that's led to is players knowing that they will get an opportunity and a platform to perform, because it's such a well-tuned system where players come over and they are immediately loaned out to Liefering, which is Salzburg's feeder club in the second division of Austrian football. There they get competitive football while also playing some of them in the UEFA Youth League for under-19s, sort of the under-19 Champions League. And they know that there's a path to the first team, and so many players take that path. And then when you're impressing at Salzburg, there's this very strong connection, which I'm sure many football fans are aware of, with Leipzig. So there's a general sort of path to move on. So I think it's just very attractive for players, and it's a very well-run operation.
Yeah, because I think Salzburg have a player who's about to move to Leipzig, a striker who was linked with Manchester United.
Would this be Benjamin Šeško?
That's the one. I'll let you pronounce the surname.
Yeah, I actually interviewed him a couple of months back. He's a really nice guy. He has only been in Austria, I think, for it might be 3 years. And that's what tends to happen. Players come, they impress so quickly, and then they move on because they're spotted by bigger clubs. He scored, if you haven't seen it yet, go on YouTube and type in Šeško, that's Sesko, against Sweden, because he scored a real sort of a Van Basten-esque volley in a Euro qualifier last year. I asked him about that, and I said, do you think it was one of the best goals in your career? And he said, I actually thought it was one of the best goals in football in general. And it's actually hard to argue if you look at it on YouTube. So he's one to watch. He's going to Leipzig. This is a bit of a controversial connection, because you have, I think, over the last 10 years or so, around 20 players have moved from Salzburg to Leipzig. So I think there are, all sorts of things about, is this anti-competitive, and, is this good for football, which I understand. But interestingly, the two clubs did meet in a Europa League tie a few years back, and Salzburg won both of them. So they didn't, fare too badly given the number of players that they've sold to Leipzig.
Yeah, and it seems Šeško is a very confident young striker, and another confident young striker was Erling Haaland, who, he started in Scandinavia, moved to Salzburg before, and then moved to Dortmund, and now he's, breaking all sorts of Premier League records for Man City. Do you remember the very first time you saw his name, and what was the story around him?
So actually, the short answer is no, I don't remember it, because Erling Haaland's time in Austria was just over in a flash. So he signed from Molde for, I think, 8 million, which is quite a big outlay for Salzburg as far as it goes. And he signed in the January of, I forget, years have gone past so quickly. It might have been January 2019, I think. And he was gone by Christmas of that year to Dortmund. And actually, for the first few months, he barely played. He wasn't really factoring into the plans. And then what tends to happen, you get players moving on. It might have been Munas Dabur in this case. Players leave and they promoted him. And he just took off like a madman with his goal scoring ratio. I think in the Austrian Cup, he was averaging a goal. Over that 4 months, he was averaging a goal every 28 minutes. In the league, it was every 61 minutes. And then, of course, you had the moment where everybody really started to sit up and take notice. And that was Champions League match day 1, because I think that might have been Salzburg's first season in the Champions League. There was a long running sort of curse where, due to Austria's place in the UEFA coefficient, Salzburg were having to go through qualifiers every year. And they somehow just could not get over the line. There were some losses in there to the likes of Dudelange from Luxembourg, and other clubs as well, and they just simply could not get into the group phase. And I think finally Austria got to a place where they managed to qualify automatically, not through a qualifier, and that was it. They were finally there, and they beat Genk 5-1 in that game, with Erling Haaland scoring a first half hat trick. Now, one of my big regrets in Austrian football is that I wasn't at that game, but my co-host Simon Clark was. And I think it's just sort of one of those moments that will go down in Champions League history, because if you think Wayne Rooney's debut for Man United. I think it was against Fenerbahce, hat-trick, first Man United player to score a hat-trick on his debut for 99 years. And everybody sat up and took notice of who the hell is this? And it was the same for Haaland, really. From that point onwards, there was so much media attention on him. He was just head and shoulders above everyone else. And I sort of thought he might stay until the end of that season. Get at least one season. He might actually want to go away with a Bundesliga winner's medal and a cup winner's medal. But that was it. By November, the rumors started sort of surfacing that he might be on the move. And by, by December, I think the transfer went through to Borussia Dortmund.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's more people I could talk to, Lee, that have had a better look at Haaland's career before he got to City, because then obviously he goes to Dortmund, a club very close to your heart, as we've mentioned. Could you see his development? Was he just becoming a monster, basically?
Yeah, I think it wasn't until he got to Dortmund that I really realized, okay, this guy is going to be like... I don't know if it's too... It's brilliant hindsight, isn't it? But I don't know if it's fair to say that I realized he'd be as good as Mbappe or a player like that. But I knew he was going to really compete with the best by the time he got to Germany, because in Austria... the league is great, but he was so clearly the best. And in Germany, he just immediately scored against Augsburg on his debut. I think it was Augsburg. And that was it. The goals just kept coming at a crazy rate. And I think that it was at that point that I thought, yeah, this guy is probably going to go to England in a few years. I had hoped, being a Manchester United fan, that it wouldn't be to Man City. But I suppose for sentimental reasons, that move made sense.
Yeah. And just thinking back, Lee, if you can remember that the short burst of goals for Salzburg, what's been the biggest change in this game? Do you think it is? Do you think it's sort of because he's always been a goal scorer, hasn't he? But have you seen sort of a physicality? Is it more a confidence? What do you think the biggest thing has been where he's been able to go from there just to there?
That's a hard question, especially because now my day-to-day life is so consumed by watching football. So that involves Austrian and German Bundesliga on the weekend. It doesn't create much room for more football in my life. And so I haven't really watched that much of Erling Haaland in the Premier League. I think probably movement is one of the things that you started to see most when he moved to Dortmund, that sort of improved. But that killer instinct and, always looking to get a shot away and always seeming to find the net. He's had that since Salzburg, really. So it's hard for me, as somebody that doesn't regularly consume Premier League football anymore, to identify the ways in which he's improved. I just know he had most of it from the start.
Yeah. And you mentioned that it's great in hindsight, but what was the media like in Austria around Haaland when he did start scoring the goals? Because obviously I'm an Evertonian, so I fully remember Wayne Rooney when he burst. I mean, I knew about Wayne Rooney when he was a 14-year-old. What was it like with Haaland? Was the media sort of onto how good he could be, or were they even taken by surprise, you think?
I think there was a bit of surprise there because, Salzburg bring through amazing players all the time. You have to look, Patson Daka, Hwang Hee-chan, these players are now in the Premier League. Naby Keita, there was Sadio Mane. Sorry to mention those to an Evertonian, former Liverpool players. But they brought through a lot of really good players. And I do feel that sort of the attitude at the time was, here's somebody who is better than all of those.
Yeah, and you've mentioned, Lee, the other players that have come through, the likes of Sadio Mane, one of the best players in Europe over the last decade. But are there any players to watch out for that you fancy, could, play in the bigger leagues in Europe?
Well, there's one that's gone already, and it's actually not a Salzburg player, which I think is perhaps why I'd be more keen to talk about him, because when you talk about Austrian football, there's so much Salzburg in there. Rasmus Hojlund had a similar trajectory to Haaland in the sense that he came to Austria, played for Sturm Graz, was only here for a short time, and then left for Atalanta. So he's in Italy now. And he is kind of... he's a big Nordic striker whose name begins with H, got a great left foot and a cracking finish. So that there are so many parallels with Haaland, perhaps not quite at his level, but he's doing great things for Atalanta and for Denmark now, where I think he's really become their leading man. And we might see quite a bit more of him in the future. Another player that has already left this summer was the Austrian Bundesliga's player of the season this season. That's Nicolas Seiwald. And he's a midfielder that just controls the tempo of the game. A midfield metronome, kind of sort of gingery hair, reminds me of Paul Scholes in certain ways. Of course, Paul Scholes was an incredible talent, but Nicolas Seiwald would have been my pick for Bundesliga player of the season. So I was happy to see that the league thought so too. And he's one of those players that's moved on to Leipzig now as well.
Yeah. And it seems, Lee, that, you know, the access is great in Austria, and in terms of the podcast, which, you know, you've mentioned that Man United played LASK. You know, what other teams have you had the opportunity to see and talk about?
Well, LASK played a 3-3 draw with Jose Mourinho's Spurs. That was a pretty good one to be at. I think most of the English clubs have been out here. I think, fortunately for us, our time covering Austrian football was coincided with a real rise in the league. So we've seen a lot of really good teams. We've seen, you know, Diego Simeone and Atletico Madrid. I've seen Barcelona in a friendly, Napoli, Roma, even some more obscure teams, which sort of appeals to my, you know, my love for sort of football off the beaten track. So like Ludogorets, I saw them play a 4-3 with LASK. Just teams from literally all over the continent. And it's been great because it is a league where there's not that much coverage. And so that made it easier for us to get media accreditation and start going to games in all the European competitions. So now the best time of year for us, it's like our Christmas, is when the group stage draw is made. You got all of these games. We're deciding which one of the three of us is going to which game. And yeah, we end up, I mean, I don't go to as many games as the other two, but I think they'll rack up sort of, I don't know, 20, 30 a season, maybe even more.
Yeah. And you mentioned teams off the beaten track, Lee, you know, and Austria's standing in football. Surely the Conference League is going to make that stronger for the, you know, the opportunity to play in another tournament. And it means that, you know, it won't just be Salzburg who've got that access.
Yeah, the Conference League is one of the best things in my eyes that UEFA have done, along with the Nations League, because I feel that there is a point where football is going down a road that it can't come back from, because the biggest leagues and the biggest countries get so wealthy. It's not a Champions League anymore. The competition has 20 out of its 32 teams from 5 countries, and there are so many champions that are just not involved anymore. And I think that that's pretty dangerous, because it feels like a lot of countries are being left behind. And so from an international perspective, the Nations League, from a club perspective, the Conference League, these competitions are giving fans amazing away days, teams the opportunity to compete at a continental level. It's just brilliant. And I'm not necessarily somebody who would praise everything UEFA have done. I really dislike certain things. For example, this constant search, or this constant increasing of the number of teams that play in, say, your international tournaments. I feel that distorts the quality a little bit, even though it gives other countries the chance to play. So I'm not a fan of everything, but the Conference League in particular is a competition I love. The only shame, I think, is that, you know, it is still being dominated by sort of the 6th or 7th best club from whether it's the Premier League or Italy, because that is how big the financial chasm is now between, you know, the big leagues and everybody else. But as a concept, I love it.
Yeah, it is brilliant. It is really good to just see different, as you say, champions. You know, they should be able to play on the European stage. So I completely agree. And just quickly on the Austria national team as well, Lee. Sort of from my memory, Austria, I remember playing in France '98, but really the national team hasn't had much success or participation. And I know that you know, they've got a player of the quality of David Alaba, and they've also got Ralf Rangnick at the helm now as well. Have you seen an improvement recently?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were becoming very frustrated before, because the previous coach was Franco Foda, and it felt like he had this brilliant generation of players, many of whom were playing a similar brand of football, whether it was at Salzburg, Leipzig, or another club, but they weren't, you know, the whole concept of pressing and fast transitions, this kind of thing, it wasn't foreign to them, and it felt like they were capable of so much more, but they were on a leash and they weren't really allowed to play the way that they could. And that was really disappointing because there was just constant underachievement, except perhaps one notable game, which is where Austria almost eliminated Italy from the last European Championships with a late goal and then a goal that wasn't allowed. So overall, it was really disappointing. And then Ralf Rangnick was appointed, and I don't think anybody expected it, especially because he was the current Manchester United manager at the time. So that obviously brought a lot of media attention to Austria, because initially the job was supposed to be a dual one where he would stay in a consultancy role with Manchester United and manage the Austrian national team. But it was quickly decided that wasn't feasible. His full focus is on Austria. And in his very first game, it was away in the Nations League, match day 1 against Croatia. And obviously everybody knows now how good Croatia are and the generation of players that they have. But nobody expected Austria to win 3-0 in Croatia. And I think it opened our eyes to what is possible with this current group of players. And it's not to say it's all been plain sailing, because, they didn't, and they lost to France and to Denmark in that Nations League group. But now we're in the Euro qualifiers, and they almost beat Belgium in Belgium, ended up drawing 1-1. They beat Sweden. It feels like good things are coming. And obviously we have a Euro just over the border in Germany next year. And I think there's plenty of reason to be optimistic now.
Yeah, brilliant. And as well as the OtherBundesliga, Lee, you also host the Sweeper podcast, which gives love to all 55 countries. How enjoyable has it been to just learn about more leagues and to, talk about them and share more stories, really? Yeah,
that project is one that is very close to my heart, and I spend a hell of a lot of time on. I love it, and I feel that I'm very lucky, because it's not just the football that I'm interested in; it's the travel, it's the geopolitics, the geography, the history, and I feel like I get to learn about these things and then tell people about them, and that is, I think it's very, very important to be happy in your job. And I couldn't be happier doing that on a daily basis. It's a podcast that I first launched with my now OtherBundesliga co-host, Tom Midler, and he's doing very well in the world of commentary now. So I make the Sweeper with somebody else, that's Paul Watson, and he is the former national team coach of Pohnpei, one of the 4 states in Micronesia. He just went out there in, I think, was it 2009, and became the world's youngest football manager. He's run clubs in Mongolia, an anti-corruption football club in Mongolia. And he has this just amazing CV of all the places he's been to. So when the opportunity to make the Sweeper and bring it back with him as well came up, that was just a great match. And we've been going now since the relaunch, we've been going for about 5 months, and it feels like it's starting to take off now. Word is getting out a little bit that, there's a podcast that talks about European football, and it's not just 5 leagues. It's been a lot of fun to make, and I'm very curious to see where it can go and how far it can go.
Yeah. And a good example of, just how far you go in terms of providing stories. You actually watched San Marino recently extend their losing streak.
Yeah, that's right. So when we looked at the Euro qualifiers, we thought, where is San Marino's best possible chance to get a win? And so a bit of a backstory here. They are the world's worst national team, according to the FIFA rankings. In 30 years or so of existence, they have only won 1 competitive game against Liechtenstein in 2004. They haven't won now for 19 years. The other day, it was actually 7,000 days since they last won a competitive game. And I think a lot of people have started to follow them now. There's some sort of appeal in this perennial loser that people find charming or intriguing or whatever you want to call it. So they've developed quite a following, and they are one of our main stories. Every international break, we track them. Can San Marino finally get a win? So we looked at the UEFA Euro fixtures, and with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps this was an erroneous choice, but I chose Kazakhstan at home because Kazakhstan, as you know, are not, or previously have not been, a huge name in European football. But then I saw that they came back to beat Denmark 3-2 in the last international break and thought, well, that might have been an error. So I went to San Marino. Actually, after I booked the flights, the game got moved to Parma, which was a little bit of an inconvenience. So I went up by train to Parma and watched them. And I was actually very surprised at how good they were, because they were really defensively organized, which you'd expect sort of a minnow that plays on the back foot to be. But they were really having a go at Kazakhstan. They actually hit the bar, and that might not sound like a huge thing, you know, celebrating when they hit the bar, but they haven't scored a competitive goal since September 21. So they were really knocking on the door. And in the end, it was a combination of I think it was a misclearance, an unlucky penalty, and an own goal. So they did lose 3-0 in the end. But yeah, it's stories like that that I really love to cover, because everybody's talking about your Bayern Munichs or your Manchester Cities or the international game, Brazil or Spain or whatever. But there are some incredible stories, if you dig a little bit deeper, that are going on in other places. And that's what the sweep is all about.
Yeah. And when you do dig deeper, it also takes you to places like Liechtenstein.
Yeah, that was one of my more madcap ones. I went to Liechtenstein in May to watch the cup final. Liechtenstein's interesting because it's the only one of those 55 UEFA nations that doesn't have its own league. And that's because it's only got 7 clubs. So they all compete in Switzerland, in the Swiss pyramid. And that is their only route into Europe, by winning that cup. And then they can potentially qualify for the Conference League if they successfully negotiate all of those qualifying rounds. So I decided that I would go and watch the cup final in the hope that Bowsers, who play in the 5th division of Swiss football, could upset the mighty Vaduz, who are by far Liechtenstein's best team. They have 49 domestic cups, more than I think any other club in the world. And unfortunately, it wasn't to be. They lost pretty heavily in the end. Bowsers did. But that experience was great. And I tried to add a little bit of extra, I don't know if spice is the right word, but there's a hiking trail through Liechtenstein, which takes you all the way from the south of the country to the top. And it's a small place, but it's not as small as I thought. And it's 158 kilometers squared. And I did this hiking trail of about 45 kilometers, aiming to go past every single football stadium in the country on the way. And I ended up doing 5 in one day and finishing off the next day. But that was just a lot of fun. We went up into the hills of a place called Triesenberg, where there was I think it was some kind of religious service, but it came across as very culty. And it felt a little bit like that scene at the end of Hot Fuzz, where they're all saying, you know, the greater good. So walked past that, walked past a lot of farmland, saw some spectacular stadiums, and then ended up, the hike finished at the Liechtenstein Football Association's sort of academy grounds, where there was a girls' team that was playing. So we got a little bit of football there at the end as well. So that the whole experience is great. And all it does is it leaves me with Andorra as the only European microstate I haven't been to yet. So that would undoubtedly be next.
Yeah. And what's been your favourite story from Europe this year, Lee?
There's a lot to pick from. If I had, can I go up to 12 months back? Is that allowed?
Yeah, go on. That is allowed. Go on. I'll allow it.
So to move on from one Liechtenstein story to another, last summer was a really big game, because I had my OtherBundesliga hat on and my sweeper hat on. There was a game between Rapid Vienna and Vaduz of Liechtenstein. Now, a club from Liechtenstein had never made it to the group stages of a European competition before. Never happened. And in the final qualifying round, Vaduz were in Vienna, aiming to get in the Conference League for the very first time. And that was just sort of a coming together of all of my interests, because I had the OtherBundesliga Twitter open on one device, tweeting from the Rapid perspective. I had the sweeper open, tweeting from the Vaduz perspective. And Vaduz managed it somehow. And so I happened to be filming at the very end of the game as the final whistle went, and all the players streamed onto the pitch. And we really went viral that night. You know, that footage was used by the BBC and lots of other media outlets. And it felt like I was there for a really big moment, not just for me personally, but for Vaduz, for Liechtenstein football, for minnows and just generally for the Conference League. So that was probably my personal highlight of the last year.
Yeah. So what teams and countries are left, Lee, on the bucket list? What are the ones that you'd like to do next?
Everywhere I haven't been yet, El. So there's plenty. Andorra, to tick off all the microstates, would be good. I really do want to go to the Faroe Islands because that's a place with some incredible stories as well. You know, the Faroe Islands is a place that appointed it's the first top flight club in Europe was TB, I think, Suðuroy, and they became the first ever men's club to appoint a female coach a couple of years back. You've got two clubs in the capital, Tórshavn, that share a stadium, and they've got one stand in one of their colours and the other stand right next to it in the other one, which is, you know, where do you see that? You've got like one away day in the Faroe Islands involves going in an under the sea tunnel to get between the islands. There's the world's first under the sea roundabout. So there's all sorts of weird and quirky things in the Faroes that I'd love to see. Greenland as well, going outside of UEFA, because they have the Greenlandic Football Championship, which is the world's shortest league season. It lasts 1 week, and you get all of the different participating teams flying in from across Greenland, and you know, sleeping in a sports hall and playing against each other for a week. So that's very high. I interviewed the president of the Greenlandic Football Federation a couple of years ago, and he said, you know, do come and let me know. So that's on the bucket list. And finally, I would say Kazakhstan, because I was doing a sweeper podcast the other day and talking about bucket lists, and Kazakhstan is one of those places where I just know almost nothing about it, and I'd really like to go and explore a little bit. It has some of the biggest away days in European football. It's a vast country. Some teams are traveling 2,000 kilometers or more to play their away games. That has a lot of appeal as well.
Brilliantly. Honestly, we could talk for hours, couldn't we? Just about European football. But no, it was really good to talk to you, just to get an insight into, you know, there is just so much more football out there, isn't there, to be explored. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're preaching to the choir. I just love looking at all of these little leagues and all of these different countries. Little sounds belittling, but it comes from a place of affection. There's a lot of good stuff out there. So if you want to find out more, then the Sweeper podcast is the place to be. So do join us. Yeah, definitely do recommend the Sweeper and the OtherBundesliga. Thanks for your time today, Lee, and obviously stay tuned to Sport Quotes and Facts Untold, where we'll bring, hopefully, you know, some more unique insights and stories from around the world of football.